In this episode, we're going to take the mystery out of penetration testing and replace it with a clear, beginner-friendly picture of what it is not, and why it matters in the real world of security. A lot of people hear the phrase penetration testing and immediately imagine dramatic movie scenes, people pounding keyboards, and systems collapsing in seconds. The reality is much more professional, much more structured, and frankly much more useful than that. Penetration testing is best understood as a controlled, authorized attempt to find weaknesses the way an attacker might, but with the goal of improving defenses rather than causing harm. It sits in the larger family of security testing, alongside activities like vulnerability scanning, audits, reviews, and monitoring. But it has a distinct purpose because it demonstrates what can actually be done with weaknesses, not just that weaknesses exist. By the end of this, you should be able to explain penetration testing in plain language, understand the ethical boundaries that make it legitimate, and recognize what good outcomes look like when it's done well. A helpful starting point is understanding how penetration testing differs from simply looking for vulnerabilities, because beginners often mix these ideas together. A vulnerability scan is typically an automated process that checks systems and applications for known issues, like missing patches or risky configurations, and it often produces a long list of findings. Penetration testing goes further by using human judgment and deliberate steps to show whether weaknesses can be chained together to reach a meaningful outcome, like accessing sensitive data or taking control of a critical function. That difference matters because security teams and business leaders do not just need to know what is theoretically wrong. They need to know what is practically exploitable and what risk it creates. Penetration testing also has a storytelling element, not in the sense of drama, but in the sense of explaining the path an attacker could take and what would happen if that path succeeds. When done responsibly, it turns technical details into a clear narrative of risk backed by evidence. That is why penetration testing is often used to validate whether defenses are working the way people believe they are working. Scope is the foundation that keeps penetration testing useful and safe, and it is one of the first concepts you should treat as non-negotiable. Scope means defining exactly what the tester is allowed to touch, what is off-limits, and what success looks like for the engagement. It can include specific networks, applications, cloud resources, or even physical locations, and it should also specify the time window, the testing intensity, and any special constraints. A properly scoped test prevents accidental disruption and prevents misunderstandings that can cause real damage, like testing a production system too aggressively or touching a third-party service that has not agreed to be involved. Scope also prevents a different kind of failure, where the test becomes too vague to produce meaningful results. If the instructions are fuzzy, the tester might spend time in the wrong places, or the organization might assume it was tested when it was not. In simple terms, scope is the map, the rules of the road, and the boundary fence all at once, and without it the entire activity becomes reckless instead of responsible. Ethics is what separates legitimate security testing from harmful intrusion, and it is not optional or implied. It is explicit and enforced through permission and accountability. Ethical penetration testing begins with clear authorization from the system owner, not just a vague nod from someone who sounds important. That authorization should be formal enough that everyone involved can point to it if questions arise, and it should be detailed enough that it matches the scope and methods being used. Ethical behavior also means respecting privacy, minimizing unnecessary data exposure, and avoiding actions that create risk beyond what was agreed. For example, if a tester gains access to sensitive information, the ethical approach is to capture only what is necessary to prove access, protect that evidence carefully, and stop digging once the objective is demonstrated. Ethical testing is also honest testing, meaning the tester does not hide mistakes, does not exaggerate findings, and does not manipulate results to look impressive. In a mature security culture, ethics is not just about being a good person. It is about building trust so the organization can learn from the test without fear that the test itself became a threat. A practical way to understand ethics in this space is to think about intent, consent, and impact as three anchors that should always stay aligned. Intent is the goal of improving security, which means the tester's choices should be guided by learning and validation, not by showing off or pushing boundaries for sport. Consent is the permission granted by the organization, which means the tester must stay inside the agreed scope and methods, and stop when consent ends or conditions change. Impact is the real-world effect of actions taken, which means the tester should avoid unnecessary disruption and should treat operational stability as part of security, not as an afterthought. When any of these anchors drift, problems happen quickly. A tester with good intent but poor attention to consent can still break trust, and a tester who chases impact without care can cause downtime and real losses. This is why professional penetration testing includes planning, communication, and guardrails, because ethical testing is not just a moral stance. It is a disciplined practice that reduces risk while exploring risk. Methods in penetration testing can sound intimidating because people hear terms like reconnaissance, exploitation, and privilege escalation, but you can understand them as a logical sequence of questions. First, what is there to target, meaning what systems, services, or applications exist and how they are exposed. Second, what weaknesses exist, meaning what misconfigurations, missing controls, or known vulnerabilities could be present. Third, can those weaknesses be used to gain access or influence, meaning can an attacker-like action succeed in a controlled way? Fourth, once access is gained, what is the value or impact, meaning what the attacker could do next, such as reaching sensitive information or controlling a process? Finally, how would a defender detect and stop this, and what fixes would meaningfully reduce risk? Even when the test is focused on a small scope, the method is still about moving from discovery to validation to impact, and then to recommendations. That final step is crucial because a penetration test that ends with only dramatic proof but no clear path to improvement is entertainment, not security. Reconnaissance is often the first phase people associate with penetration testing, and it is simply the act of gathering information that shapes the rest of the test. In ethical testing, reconnaissance can include passive steps like reviewing what information is publicly available and active steps like enumerating exposed services within the allowed scope. The core idea is that attackers rarely start with a perfect map. They build a picture from hints, patterns, and responses, and testers do the same to understand where weak points might exist. For beginners, a useful mental model is that reconnaissance is like walking around a building to see which doors exist, which windows are open, and which lights are on, without yet trying to force entry. The results of reconnaissance guide time and effort because a good tester prioritizes high-value targets and likely weaknesses instead of poking randomly. Reconnaissance also helps avoid accidental harm because knowing what you are touching prevents you from testing the wrong system. In a professional report, reconnaissance matters because it explains how an attacker would realistically find the organization, not just how they would break it. Exploitation is the step that gets the most attention, but it should be understood as a careful, evidence-driven attempt to prove a weakness can lead to unauthorized capability. That capability might be reading data, changing data, running a command, or impersonating a user, depending on the scope and rules. In ethical testing, exploitation is typically performed with restraint, meaning the tester aims for the minimum action needed to prove the issue without causing instability. Think of it like testing a lock by showing it can be opened, not by destroying the doorframe to make a point. Exploitation is also rarely a single magic trick. It often depends on conditions that reconnaissance uncovered, like an exposed service combined with weak authentication or a misconfigured permission. When testers talk about chaining, they mean using one weakness to reach another, which is realistic because attackers often use small gaps to reach bigger ones. The key concept for you is that exploitation is not the goal by itself. It is a tool used to demonstrate risk in a way that supports better decisions. One of the most important beginner concepts is understanding that penetration testing is not just about breaking in, but about measuring what happens after a foothold is gained. This is where ideas like lateral movement and privilege changes come into play, and you do not need to know the technical tricks to understand the purpose. If an attacker gets a small access point, the next question is whether that access can spread to other systems or gain more power, because that determines the scale of potential damage. A well-designed environment tries to limit this spread through segmentation, least privilege, and monitoring, and a penetration test can show whether those defenses are actually working. If a tester can move from a low-value system to a high-value one, that is a story about weak boundaries, not just about one flawed system. If a tester can take a basic user identity and reach administrative control, That is a story about permission design and credential protection, not just about a single mistake. These outcomes matter because organizations often assume internal systems are safe once the perimeter is crossed, and penetration testing challenges that assumption in a structured way. Another crucial concept is that not all penetration tests have the same style, and understanding these styles helps you interpret what results do and do not mean. A test can be closer to a black box approach, where the tester starts with minimal information, which can resemble an external attacker learning as they go. A test can be closer to a white box approach, where the tester is given more internal information, which can produce deeper findings because time is not wasted on discovering what the organization already knows. There are also in-between approaches where some information is shared to focus effort, which is often the most practical in real organizations. The style chosen affects what the test can reasonably uncover in the time allowed, and it affects how you should interpret a lack of findings. If a black box test finds little, it might mean defenses are strong, or it might mean the scope and time-limited exploration. If a white box test finds a lot, it might mean there are serious issues, or it might mean the tester could look deeper and therefore uncovered more. The lesson is that penetration testing outcomes depend heavily on the agreed method, so you should always connect results back to scope, time, and starting knowledge. Useful outcomes are the real reason organizations invest in penetration testing, and they should be framed as improvements to security posture rather than trophies of compromise. A useful outcome can be confirming that a control works as expected, like showing that segmentation actually prevents a tester from reaching sensitive areas. A useful outcome can be finding a specific weakness and providing evidence that it can be exploited, which makes it easier for decision makers to prioritize fixing it. Another useful outcome is discovering gaps in detection and response, meaning the test reveals that security monitoring did not notice suspicious activity that it should have noticed. Penetration testing can also help validate assumptions, like whether a critical application is truly protected by strong authentication and well-scoped permissions. The best outcomes usually include clear recommendations that are realistic, prioritized, and connected to the organization's environment, not generic advice that could apply to anyone. In other words, the outcome should help the organization decide what to do next, what to fix first, and what to measure to ensure the fix stays effective. A beginner-friendly way to think about value is to separate findings into technical issues, control issues, and process issues, because penetration testing often uncovers all three, even when the test seems purely technical. Technical issues might include insecure configurations, outdated components, or weak authentication patterns that can be exploited. Control issues are broader, like a lack of segmentation, overly broad permissions, or missing monitoring that makes technical weaknesses much more dangerous. Process issues might include slow patching, unclear ownership, or a lack of clear escalation paths when something suspicious is detected. A penetration test can highlight these because the tester experiences the environment the way an attacker would, and attackers take advantage of both technology and human process gaps. When organizations treat penetration test results as just a list of technical fixes, they often miss the bigger patterns that keep creating new vulnerabilities. The most mature organizations use penetration testing as a feedback mechanism for how they build, operate, and defend systems over time. That is why a good test report often talks about themes and systemic improvements, not just individual flaws. It is also important to understand what penetration testing cannot do, because unrealistic expectations can lead to disappointment or false confidence. A penetration test is a snapshot in time, so it cannot guarantee that a system will remain secure after the test ends, especially if changes happen frequently. It is also constrained by scope and time, so it cannot prove the absence of vulnerabilities. It can only show what was found within the agreed boundaries. Penetration testing is not the same as a full security program, and it does not replace patching, secure design, monitoring, training, and governance. Another common misconception is that a penetration test automatically means an organization is safe if the tester did not succeed in a dramatic compromise, but that is not a reliable conclusion. The value is in what the test did observe, validate, and recommend, not in the thrill of whether the tester got a high-impact outcome. When you keep these limits in mind, you can use penetration testing as one strong tool among many, rather than expecting it to do everything. When you bring all of this together, The simplest professional definition is that penetration testing is an authorized, scoped, ethical simulation of attacker behavior designed to produce evidence-based improvements to security. Scope prevents chaos, ethics prevents harm, and methods provide a repeatable way to discover and validate risk. Useful outcomes are not about proving someone was careless or making a team look bad. They are about helping the organization see reality clearly and improve based on that reality. For a beginner, that mindset shift is one of the most important parts of learning security because it moves you away from thinking of security as secrets and tricks and toward thinking of security as disciplined risk management. As you keep studying, you will see penetration testing concepts connect to many other areas, like incident response, logging, identity, segmentation, and secure design, because they all share the same goal of reducing the chances and impact of compromise. If you can explain penetration testing as a responsible, outcomes-driven practice that respects boundaries and produces actionable learning, you will already be thinking the way strong security professionals think, even before you learn any specific techniques.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.